How do you mitigate your risk? Montel's forecasting services cover risks from hours ahead to years ahead. We welcome you to hedge your market exposure with our diverse forecasting portfolio. Contact us at sales@montelnews.com for more info and a free trial.
Hello listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast. Bring you energy matters in an informal setting. My name is Richard Sverrisson. Today, the penultimate pod before we take a summer break will be in a slightly different format. We will take you on a journey around Europe, speaking to our desk editors to discuss the key issues of the first 6 months of the year and the outlook for the remainder of 2020. Joining me here in Montel headquarters is Olav Vilnes, Chief Editor Nordics. A warm welcome to you, Olav. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you, Richard.
We're looking at the biggest issues in the Nordic markets in the first half of the year. Could you run us through some of the key issues?
I think the main issue for most of the people in the market is the dramatic price movements that we've seen. Last year, you had an average price in the Nordic market of close to 40 euros. So far this year, it's dropped to 10 euros. So that's a huge drop. And in June, we even saw record low average prices for any month since this market began, with 3.15 euros for the system price. And if you go on an area level, it fell all the way down to 1.46 euros in southern parts of Norway, where you have all the hydropower plants.
These price levels haven't been unaffected by the coronavirus at all, have they? That's the pandemic is something quite separate.
It is quite separate. I think the price fall would have come anyway, because the coronavirus created a lot of uncertainty when it arrived. It had the first lockdowns in March. But the effect on power consumption has been much lower in the Nordic market than it has been elsewhere in Europe. So I think the prices have mainly reacted to the weather in the winter, which was unusually warm, it was unusually windy, and also very wet. And the wet weather, it came as snow high in the mountains. And that snow reserves, they have sort of built up during the winter. And when it came into May, they were close to a record high. And it has all melted into reservoirs now in June, and it will continue to do so even this month.
But the whole of the Nordic market isn't seeing low prices, though, is it, Olav? I mean, there's some key price variations.
Yeah, and you can say the hydropower plants, they are the biggest hydropower plants are located in Norway and also in northern parts of Sweden. And these regions have seen very low spot prices. But there have also been issues with the transmission links from these areas, from Norway to Sweden, from northern to southern Sweden. And these restrictions have sort of increased the price differences between the bidding zones. So, for example, in June, you had much higher prices in Sweden, in southern Sweden than in Norway and northern Sweden. One day you had a price of 80 euros in southern Sweden and Finland, while it was close to 1 euro in Norway. And these huge price variations have created another debate about the nuclear plants in Sweden, where they are about to close another reactor at the end of this year. Vattenfall actually decided when prices were very low in April, that they would keep the Ringhals 1 nuclear power plant offline for the entire summer. But with the recent developments in southern Sweden, they have actually been paid money by the TSO to keep this reactor in operation throughout the summer. So it just highlights and has also recreated a political debate in Sweden about whether it's wise to close down the nuclear plants at this time, or whether you should keep them on for maybe 1 or 2 more years.
Let's look forward a bit, Olav. What do you think will be the key drivers in the remainder of the year and maybe into early next?
I think a key driver would be the recovery, and if you will see prices coming back to the levels that they used to be normally. We have spoken to market analysts this week who said that maybe you could see the system price level go about 20 euros in late October. Earlier in those areas that do not have much hydropower production, and maybe even later in Norway. But that's an interesting part. The coronavirus creates some uncertainty over that, of course. If you have like a lower industrial demand due to a persistent weakness in the world economy, that's one major point of uncertainty going into the autumn.
So in terms of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, that may not happen until later this year or next, if at all. Is that what you're saying?
I say that there is this uncertainty, but at the moment it does not have a huge impact. But if you have the industrial output falling, if the demand for the products, aluminium, paper, other kind of metals if the world demand is falling, then of course you could see closures also on factories in the Nordic region, which again will have a knock-on effect on power demand, and that will keep prices lower for a longer time. A second important factor is of course the weather, which can of course, if it gets very wet in the autumn, then you will also keep prices at lower levels.
So the oversupply could continue into, certainly to the end of the year and maybe beyond. So Olav, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Next, I'm joined by Chris Eales. He's our editor France and is fond of wearing double denim. Though it may be shorts today, Chris.
Well, listen, I have something to say to you, Richard. Right. What is the common thread between Bob Marley and John Lennon?
John Lennon or Lennon?
No, John Lennon, not Lenin.
Yeah, please enlighten me, Chris.
They both wore double denim.
Let's get on to energy markets. We're talking about the key issues in the first 6 months of the year. Now, what's been the most surprising impact of the pandemic on your markets, which is France?
I don't know if it's been the most surprising, but the most significant impact has been on nuclear output. And that has been massively hit as a result of the pandemic's impact on demand, on power demand. So you had a 20% cut in power demand, which led EDF, the nuclear operator in France, to then cut their forecast for nuclear output this year down to 300 terawatt hours, which compared to last year's nuclear output represents, if that target is met, represents a fall of nearly 30% from last year. That is a massive impact on the power supply demand situation in France. So I don't know whether that you can describe that as surprising, but that is definitely the biggest impact, which will have implications for years to come.
What do you expect to be? I mean, obviously this will keep driving the market in France, certainly the electricity market in France and in its neighbours as well in the rest of the year. Are there any other issues that you think will be key?
Well, yeah, other issues are certainly the future of AREN. AREN being not a Scottish jumper, but the regulation governing the sale of EDF's nuclear output to rivals is currently set at 42 euros a megawatt hour and concerns a quarter of EDF's annual nuclear output. There's been a big fight over this, AREN, because the pandemic, all roads lead to the pandemic, because the pandemic cut power prices across Europe and in France, meaning that it was cheaper to buy power on the wholesale market and not to get it on the regulated rate of 42 euros. So there's been a big fight between EDF suppliers and EDF themselves, who are also struggling because of the low power prices. It led to a court battle, which is ongoing. The force majeure was declared by at least 3 companies, meaning that they no longer had to supply at the 42 rate, because it meant that they had to sell off their power that they had bought, were contracted to buy at less than half the price that they bought it for. So big impact for small suppliers, or not small suppliers, but suppliers, alternative suppliers, rivals to EDF, Total. I'm talking about Total Direct Energy, for example, Alpic, Gazelle Energy. These 3 all triggered force majeure. But EDF, in response to the force majeure, decided to cancel the AREN contracts with these 3 companies, as well as appeal against court decisions to allow companies to trigger force majeure. So that situation is quite interesting, because going forward, as the prices increase, if you look at the Q4 price in France, it's hovering around 60 euros. That's above 42 euros. So you would think there's going to be renewed demand for AREN. But what does it mean when your contract for AREN this year has been cancelled? EDF went ahead and cancelled contracts for 3 companies, the companies I mentioned earlier. So what are they going to do about AREN for the rest of the year? Are they going to try to get a new contract? This is very interesting because of the higher prices in Q4. We know that because of the issues around the virus, the Q4 is very high in France. It's a premium to all of its neighbours, and there's a big debate about whether that's an accurate price, whether it's been overpriced. But the AREN is very interesting to see what happens going forward with that in the second half.
That's something that your team will be focusing very much on, both the AREN and on the ongoing reductions in nuclear availability and supply from EDF. Chris, thank you very much for joining us today. I'll have some more comparisons for you next time.
I thank you.
And now we have a hotline to Andres Cala, editor, Iberia in Madrid. Hello, Andres. How are you doing?
Doing well. Nice and warm and sunny in good old Southern Europe.
Excellent. So it's a little bit different in Northern Europe at the moment. But anyway, we're here to talk about energy, Andres. Can you talk us through the key issues of the first 6 months of the year? It's obviously been the pandemic, but what are the big takeaways from the first 6 months?
It actually has been quite unexpected. It served as a catalyst for a number of things that were already ongoing, that were in the plans, that were being thought about in some cases, but the the pandemic just made everything urgent. So what am I talking about? We're talking about at least a 12%, if not as much as 16% GDP contraction. And that, of course, just rattles everything in society, including, of course, energy. Lots of unemployment and all that. So the surprising things that came about from the pandemic, though, and which will actually be good in the long run, not in the short term. It'll be harder to actually gauge these in the short term. But we're talking about the deployment of renewables, the exit or deathbed, for that matter, of the coal-fired plants. The PPAs have consolidated. We have the gas industry. It allowed the gas industry to renegotiate a whole bunch of, bad contracts Spanish companies had, because at the end of the day, it became a buyer's market, not a seller's market in gas. And the rebound has been quite remarkable. At least in the power industry, we still expect long-term gas demand to be very low as industry picks up. And on the power side, it's been quite rapid. We've opened up, of course, now our borders, because tourism is so essential to the Spanish economy. And all of these things, and I only mention those in the energy sector, but they're just part of a broader trend of reshaping the Spanish economy in such a way that, it was in the plans. It just became a good moment to implement all the different measures, both regulatory and in practice. So we should be heading and reaching our goals. And I don't mean just renewable goals or climate change goals, just our economic growth goals, sooner than expected, even if the recovery per se takes 2 years. But instead of going or reaching where we were planning to get maybe in 2025, we're going to get there in 2023, 2024, just because of the revolutionizing effect of this pandemic.
Wow, excellent. So it's accelerated these changes, as you put, Andres. That's very interesting. Do you expect more acceleration in the rest of the year? What would be the key issues here?
Going into the future, I think Spain, Portugal, Southern Europe in general, as we also were the ones who took the biggest part of the brunt of this pandemic, we're obviously overly concerned, and we're also overly careful. Most energy companies are not going back to work in their offices for at least until the end of the year. It's just way too risky, not simply because some mistakes were corrected early on and or concern over a repeat of some of those mistakes. It's mostly just because we now realize that a lot of what the original reactions from the scientific community, to a certain extent, we can't fully trust. I mean, this is evolving way too quickly. So, to answer your question, Richard, the thing is, we don't know when the second wave is going to come. We know it's going to come, but we're ready for it. The country and certainly the energy industry is ready for it. It's handling it. Is taking precautionary measures. Even when it gets here, it'll be handled as it has been in the last 2 months. So yeah, it shouldn't cause a profound reshaping as it did in March and April, especially, and somewhat in May. So we don't know what's going to come, when it's going to come, how deep it will come, but that will not change the path of where we're going. It might delay it a bit, but that's as sad as it could get.
Absolutely. So the new normal will not be that normal. Andres, Cala, thank you very much for joining us today.
All right. Take care. Have a good week.
Thank you. You too. All the best. Bye.
Bye.
Last but certainly not least, we're joined by Christian Driessen from our Frankfurt office. Christian is our editor Germany. Welcome to you, Christian. How are you doing?
Hello, Richard. Everything's fine. Thank you.
Excellent. We're talking about the key issues of the first 6 months, obviously dominated by the coronavirus pandemic. Talk us through the biggest issues in Germany. I know it's been a very busy end of June, beginning of July for you on the policy front, but what else are the key issues here?
Exactly. The policy front has been a huge issue over the past half year because Germany failed to seal the deal on a lot of important legislative projects. The first and biggest one being the coal exit law, which they just, so to speak, dragged across the finish line early in July, giving the market a lot of clarity that has been needed in terms of what capacity is going to exit the market and under which conditions. So that has been a major stumbling block for policy because nobody had clarity about the second half of the year. Another big project has been the lack of acceptance for the wind expansion in Germany, which has basically ground to a halt over the past couple of months. And German legislators finally agreed on optional minimum distancing rules in each state that allow the heads of states to implement rules to increase the acceptance of the German wind expansion. And last but not least, there was a cap for the German solar expansion at 52 gigawatts that would effectively kill any further solar expansion once this cap was reached. Now, legislators have basically agreed on all those issues last year, but some smaller stumbling blocks caused huge delays in the process. And once the pandemic struck, it got delayed even further. So we've been basically hanging in sort of a bubble for over half year now. And they finally managed to clear all those problems up.
So the biggest impact of the coronavirus has been, in a way, or one of the big impacts has been in delaying this legislation, freeing up more renewables expansion. Would that be a correct assumption, Christian?
Exactly, yes, that's correct. And as I said, they could have done all of this last year with way less problems and way less trouble along the way. But they've been stalling, and that came around to haunt them during the pandemic.
Absolutely. How about energy prices? Did they take a big hit during the pandemic, and are they on the way back up again? Or
interestingly enough, prices took a big hit. On a European level, the carbon market remained relatively resilient, which led to gas prices or gas-fired power generation sort of take the lead in the German energy mix as soon as renewables fall short of their usual production levels. So in a way, record low gas prices in Europe mixed with a resilient carbon market led to a de facto phase out of coal-fired power generation, which basically means that the coal exit would have taken place one way or the other with or without the coal exit law. But prices have been rebounding over the past couple of weeks in June and are now back at pre-crisis levels, actually. That is, in a way, interesting because consumption still falls short of the original levels that we've seen pre-crisis. Energy quantified packed consumption over the last 2 weeks of June at roughly 92 to 93% of what's the usual level. And while they expect a slow recovery to take place, by the end of the year, we are probably still short some 3% of the regular levels. So it seems rather odd that we already reached levels that we've seen before the pandemic struck.
Absolutely. And you clarified the policy issues that have now been basically signed off. What else are the key issues in the remainder of the year then? Once we've tucked away all the renewables delays and the postponements there on the policy side.
The whole policy side has not been completely cleared because we are still waiting for the EU Commission to rubber stamp the coal exit law. Now, Berlin is very convinced that they will receive a green light for the coal exit deal, but there still is some doubt with regard to the state aid rules that the EU Commission might find it rather odd that we are throwing billions of euros at dying coal power plants while they would phase out of the market eventually all by themselves. So this is still a big unclarity. It is expected that we receive a green light for the coal exit law later in autumn, but it's not a 100% certain thing for now. Nevertheless, they will go ahead with the first tenders to remove hard coal capacity from the market, and they aim to reduce the capacity by 4 gigawatts by year end. So we will have to see how many operators really push for this first tender and try to remove some of the older units.
Thank you very much, Christian from Frankfurt. Be interesting to see if the market dynamics supersede the policymakers. But thank you for joining us today, Christian.
Thank you very much.
That's about all from the Montel Weekly Podcast this week. My thanks to Olav, Chris, Andres and Christian. I hope you listeners enjoyed the whirlwind tour around Europe. Remember to keep up to date with all our stories on Montel News. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Thank you and goodbye.